The stagecoach rattled into Independence, California on a blistering afternoon in August 1882, carrying a young woman whose heart hammered harder than the wheels against the rutted road. And Florence Jensen gripped her carpetbag so tightly her knuckles had turned white from the pressure, because she knew the lie she had written in her letters would soon be exposed to the man waiting for her at the depot. Florence pressed her face against the dusty window, searching for a glimpse of the man who had responded to her advertisement with such thoughtful, careful letters over the past 6 months. Kyle Thornton had written about his cattle ranch in the foothills, about the way the Sierra Nevada mountains turned pink at sunset, about his dreams of building something lasting in this rough territory. He had told her he was 28 years old, that he had been working his land for 5 years, and that he was looking for a wife who wanted to build a life together in this beautiful, harsh landscape. What Kyle did not know was that Florence had lied about being 23 years old when she was actually only 18. Fresh from Philadelphia with stars in her eyes and desperation in her heart after her father had died and left her with nothing but debts, and the prospect of working in a textile mill for the rest of her days. She had added 5 years to her age, because she thought no man would take seriously a girl barely out of childhood, especially not for the serious business of becoming a mail-order bride and traveling across the entire country to meet a stranger. The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the depot, and Florence took a deep breath, smoothing down her best traveling dress, a modest blue cotton affair that had seen better days but was clean and pressed. The driver opened the door and helped her down, and she stood there in the California sunshine, blinking against the brightness, her heart in her throat as she searched the crowd of rough-looking men and weathered faces for someone who might be Kyle Thornton. "Miss Jensen?" a deep voice asked, and she turned to find a tall man with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of creek water in spring, green and clear and direct. He held his hat in his hands, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the ends, and his face was lean and strong-jawed, with lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into the sun and genuine smiles. He wore clean denim trousers, a chambray shirt, and a leather vest, all well-made if not fancy, and there was something solid about him, something that made Florence feel both safer and more terrified at the same time. "Yes," she managed, her voice coming out smaller than she intended. "Are you Kyle Thornton?" "I am," he said, and his face broke into a smile that transformed his serious features into something warm and welcoming. "It is mighty good to finally meet you in person, Miss Jensen. Your journey must have been long and tiring." "Please call me Florence," she said, trying to steady herself. "And yes, it was quite a journey, but I am glad to be here at last." Kyle retrieved her trunk from the stagecoach, refusing to let her carry anything more than her small carpetbag, and led her down the main street of Independence. The town was smaller than she had imagined, just a single dusty road lined with wooden buildings that seemed to huddle together against the vast emptiness of the landscape beyond. There was a general store, a saloon, a church with a modest steeple, a blacksmith, and a handful of other establishments. Beyond the town, the land stretched out in golden brown hills dotted with scrub brush and live oaks, and in the distance, the mountains rose up like a wall against the sky. "I have arranged for you to stay at Mrs. Paulson's boarding house until the wedding," Kyle said, his voice careful and respectful. "I know you will want to rest and refresh yourself after your travels. I thought we might have supper together this evening if you are not too tired, and we can talk about our plans." Florence nodded, grateful for his thoughtfulness even as guilt twisted in her stomach. She should tell him now, she thought. She should confess the lie before things went any further. But the words stuck in her throat, and she found herself simply walking beside him, listening to him point out the various buildings and introduce her to the people they passed on the street. Mrs. Paulson's boarding house was a neat two-story structure at the edge of town, painted white with green shutters and a porch that wrapped around the front. The landlady herself was a bustling woman in her 50s with kind eyes and capable hands, and she showed Florence to a small but clean room on the second floor with a window that looked out over the hills. "Mr. Thornton is a good man," Mrs. Paulson said as she helped Florence unpack her trunk. "One of the most respected ranchers in these parts. You are fortunate to be marrying him, if you do not mind me saying so." "I know," Florence said softly, and the weight of her deception pressed down on her chest until she could barely breathe. That evening, Kyle called for her at 6 o'clock, and they walked together to the small restaurant attached to the hotel, the only establishment in town that served proper meals to ladies. The proprietor, a Chinese man named Mr. Wang, served them roast chicken with potatoes and carrots, and Kyle talked easily about his ranch, his cattle, his plans for the future. Florence found herself relaxing despite her anxiety, drawn in by his genuine enthusiasm and the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from him. "Tell me about Philadelphia," Kyle said, cutting into his chicken. "Your letters made it sound like a different world entirely from this place." Florence told him about the crowded streets, the brick buildings that blocked out the sky, the constant noise and bustle of city life. She told him about her father, who had been a clerk before he died, and about the small apartment they had shared. She did not tell him about the crushing poverty that had followed her father's death, about the landlord who had threatened to throw her out, about the factory foreman who had looked at her with hungry eyes and made her skin crawl. "It must have taken courage to leave all that behind and come west," Kyle said, and there was genuine admiration in his voice. "I know it is not easy for a woman to make such a journey, to trust a man she has only known through letters." The guilt rose up in Florence's throat like bile, and she set down her fork, her appetite suddenly gone. "Kyle," she said, forcing herself to meet his eyes, "there is something I need to tell you, something I should have told you in my letters, but I was afraid." Kyle's expression grew serious, but his voice remained gentle. "What is it, Florence? You can tell me anything." She took a deep breath, her hands twisting in her lap. "I lied about my age," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "In my letters, I told you I was 23 years old, but I am not. I am only 18. I just turned 18 this past March, and I lied because I thought no one would take me seriously if they knew how young I really was. And I was desperate to get away from Philadelphia, to have a chance at a different life. And I know it was wrong, and I understand if you do not want to marry me now, but I could not let you marry me without knowing the truth." She fell silent, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest, and she stared down at her hands, unable to bear the thought of seeing disappointment or anger in his face. There was a long moment of silence, and then Kyle reached across the table and gently covered her hands with his own. His hands were rough and calloused from years of hard work, but his touch was incredibly gentle. "Florence," he said, and she forced herself to look up at him. "Look at me, please." She raised her eyes to his face, expecting to see rejection there, but instead found something that looked almost like relief. "I do not care about numbers," Kyle said, his voice firm and steady. "What matters to me is that you are here, that you had the courage to travel all this way, and that you are honest enough to tell me the truth now when you could have just kept the secret. 18 or 23, it makes no difference to me. You are clearly a grown woman capable of making your own decisions, and if you still want to marry me, then I still want to marry you." Florence felt tears prick at her eyes, and she blinked them back fiercely. You truly do not mind. You are not angry that I lied. I understand why you did it, Kyle said, squeezing her hands gently. These are not easy times for a young woman alone in the world. I am just glad you trusted me enough to tell me the truth now. He paused, then added with a slight smile, though I will admit, it explains why some of your references to events seemed a bit off in your letters. I thought perhaps things in Philadelphia were just different from how I remembered the East. Florence let out a surprised laugh, half relief and half genuine amusement. I tried to be vague about dates, she admitted. You did a fair job of it, Kyle said, and there was warmth in his eyes that made something flutter in Florence's chest. Now shall we finish our supper, Mrs. Wang will be offended if we leave good food on our plates, and besides, we have wedding plans to discuss. They spent the next hour talking more easily than before, the lie no longer hanging between them like a wall. Kyle told her about the ranch, about the small cabin he had built with his own hands, about the herd of cattle he had been building up over the years. He was honest about the hardships too, about the long hours and the isolation, about the harsh winters and the constant work. It is not an easy life, he said frankly, but it is a good life, and it is ours to build together if you are willing. I am willing, Florence said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. They agreed to marry the following Saturday, giving Florence a week to settle in and prepare. Kyle was respectful and proper, never once trying to take advantage of her or push for intimacy before their wedding. He called on her every day, sometimes taking her for rides in his wagon to show her the surrounding countryside, sometimes simply sitting with her on Mrs. Paulson's porch and talking about everything and nothing. Florence found herself falling for him more with each passing day. It was not the dramatic, sweeping passion she had read about in novels, but something quieter and deeper, a growing sense of rightness, of having found someone who saw her truly and valued her anyway. Kyle had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard, making her laugh at unexpected moments. He was patient with her endless questions about ranch life, teaching her about cattle and horses and the rhythms of the seasons in this new land. On Wednesday, he took her out to see the ranch for the first time. They rode in his wagon for nearly an hour, following a rough track that led into the foothills. The land here was beautiful in a stark, unforgiving way, all golden grass and scattered oaks, with the mountains looming ever closer. Kyle pointed out landmarks as they went, explaining property boundaries and water sources, his face animated with pride in what he had built. The ranch itself was modest but well-maintained, a sturdy cabin with a stone chimney and a covered porch, surrounded by several outbuildings including a barn, a henhouse, and a smokehouse. There was a vegetable garden that clearly needed attention, and a creek ran through the property, providing precious water. The whole place had an air of solid competence, of a man who worked hard and took care of what was his. "It is not fancy," Kyle said, helping her down from the wagon, and there was a note of anxiety in his voice that she had not heard before. "But it is sound and weatherproof, and there is room to expand when the time comes." Florence walked slowly toward the cabin, taking in every detail. The porch had a rocking chair on it, positioned to face the sunset. There were curtains in the windows, simple muslin but clean and bright. When Kyle unlocked the door and led her inside, she found a single large room that served as kitchen, dining, and living area, with a ladder leading up to a sleeping loft. Everything was neat and organized, if somewhat sparse in decoration. "My sister helped me fix it up before she moved to Sacramento," Kyle explained, watching her face anxiously. "She made the curtains and the quilts. I know it probably seems rough compared to what you are used to in Philadelphia." "It is perfect," Florence said, and she meant it. The cabin had something her cramped apartment in Philadelphia had never had, something beyond just space and cleanliness. It had the feeling of a real home, a place where people could build a life together. "I love it, Kyle, truly." The relief on his face was almost comical, and he smiled that transforming smile again. "I am glad. I want you to be happy here, Florence. That is the most important thing to me." He showed her the rest of the property, introducing her to his 3 horses, his milk cow, and the small flock of chickens. He walked her along the creek, pointing out where he planned to plant an orchard in the spring. He was full of plans and dreams, and Florence found herself caught up in his vision, imagining herself beside him as they built this life together. Saturday arrived faster than Florence expected, bringing with it a surge of nervous excitement that made it hard to eat breakfast. Mrs. Paulson helped her dress in the new gown they had purchased from the dressmaker in town. A simple but elegant affair in cream-colored silk with tiny pearl buttons down the back. It was the most beautiful thing Florence had ever owned, and when she looked at herself in the small mirror in her room, she barely recognized the fashionable young woman staring back at her. The wedding took place in the small church at 10 o'clock in the morning, with the minister's wife playing the pump organ and half the town in attendance, despite the fact that Florence knew almost no one. Kyle stood at the front of the church in his Sunday best, a dark suit that fit him well and made him look even more handsome than usual. And when Florence walked down the aisle on Mrs. Paulson's arm, the look on his face made her breath catch in her throat. They spoke their vows in steady voices, Kyle's deep and sure, Florence's softer but no less certain. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife and Kyle kissed her gently, chastely on the lips, Florence felt something shift inside her, a sense of doors closing on her old life and opening on something new and unknown and full of possibility. The townspeople had organized a modest reception in the church hall, with coffee and cake and well wishes from people Florence was only just beginning to know. The blacksmith's wife gave them a set of kitchen knives. The general store owner contributed a sack of flour and another of sugar. Mr. Wang brought a jar of preserved ginger and a package of tea. These were practical gifts from practical people, and Florence was touched by their generosity toward a stranger. By early afternoon, Kyle and Florence were driving back out to the ranch in the wagon, now officially husband and wife. The reality of it settled over Florence slowly, along with a flutter of nervousness about the wedding night. She knew the basic facts of what happened between married couples, had heard enough whispered conversations and crude jokes, but the reality of actually experiencing it with Kyle made her mouth go dry. Kyle seemed to sense her anxiety because when they arrived at the ranch and he helped her down from the wagon, he said gently, "Florence, I want you to know that there is no rush for anything. We have the rest of our lives together. I want you to feel comfortable here first, to feel like this is truly your home." The kindness in his words made Florence's eyes prick with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "I confess I am a bit nervous." "That is only natural," Kyle said, and he took her hand, holding it gently. "How about we just spend today settling you in, and tonight we can just rest? We both have been through a lot this past week, and there is no rule that says a wedding night has to be anything more than 2 tired people getting a good night's sleep." Florence felt a rush of gratitude and affection so strong it almost overwhelmed her. She rose up on her toes and kissed him impulsively, a quick press of lips that was over almost before it began, but that made Kyle's eyes go warm and soft. They spent the afternoon in domestic tasks, Kyle showing Florence where everything was kept, Florence beginning to organize her few possessions in their new home. The loft was just tall enough to stand in at the center, with a sloped ceiling on either side where the roof came down. There was a large bed with a frame Kyle had made himself, covered in the quilts his sister had sewn, and a trunk for storage, and a small table with a wash basin. It was simple but clean and comfortable, and Florence found herself imagining waking up here every morning, watching the sun rise through the small window that faced east. That evening, they ate a simple supper of bread and cheese and cold chicken left over from the wedding reception, sitting together at the table as the sun set beyond the window, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and gold. They talked easily, the conversation flowing naturally now that the wedding was behind them and they were finally alone together in their own home. When it grew dark and the yawns could no longer be suppressed, they climbed the ladder to the loft together. Kyle discreetly turned his back while Florence changed into her nightgown, and Florence did the same while he undressed. When they finally lay down together in the bed, there was a moment of awkwardness, both of them lying stiffly on their respective sides of the mattress, leaving a careful gap between them. Then Kyle reached out and found Florence's hand in the darkness, lacing his fingers through hers. "Good night, wife," he said softly. "Good night, husband," Florence replied, and despite her nervousness, she felt a smile curve her lips. She fell asleep still holding his hand, and she slept better than she had in months. The next days and weeks fell into a pattern that was at once strange and comforting. Kyle woke before dawn every morning to tend to the animals and see to the cattle, and Florence rose with him, learning to cook on the wood stove, to gather eggs from the chickens, to milk the cow. Her hands, soft from city life, grew blistered and then calloused. Her back ached from the constant physical labor, but there was also a satisfaction in it, a sense of accomplishment that she had never felt working in the textile mill. Kyle was patient with her fumbling attempts at ranch life, never criticizing when she burned the biscuits or let the chickens escape from their coop. He taught her how to ride, starting her on his gentlest mare, a placid bay named Daisy who tolerated Florence's inexpert handling with remarkable patience. He showed her how to read the weather, how to tell which plants were safe to eat and which were poisonous, how to shoot the rifle he kept above the door in case of emergencies. And slowly, carefully, they learned each other in more intimate ways as well. Kyle never pushed her, but he was affectionate, stealing kisses when they passed each other during the day, holding her close at night as they lay in bed talking before sleep claimed them. When they finally consummated their marriage, nearly 2 weeks after the wedding, it was gentle and slow, Kyle taking his time to make sure she was comfortable, whispering reassurances and endearments against her skin. Florence had expected it to hurt, and it did, a bit, but there was also something profound about it, about the physical joining that matched their legal and emotional bond. And afterward, when Kyle held her close and kissed her forehead and told her she was beautiful and brave and perfect, Florence felt something inside her open up, some last guarded piece of her heart that she had been holding back. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness, the words spilling out before she could think better of them. Kyle's arms tightened around her. "I love you too, Florence. I think I have since the first letter you sent me, when you wrote about wanting to see the mountains and build something real." They made love more often after that, learning each other's bodies and preferences, finding joy and connection in their physical union. But it was not just the physical intimacy that bound them together. It was the shared work of building a life, the daily routines and small kindnesses, the laughter over burnt dinners and escaped chickens, the quiet evenings on the porch watching the sunset. Summer gave way to fall, and Florence helped Kyle with the harvest from the vegetable garden, learning to preserve and can the produce for the winter ahead. They made trips to town every few weeks for supplies, and Florence slowly got to know the other residents of Independence, making friends with the minister's wife and the schoolteacher, and several of the ranch wives who lived in the surrounding areas. One afternoon in late October, Florence was working in the garden, pulling up the last of the carrots before the first frost, when she heard the thunder of hoofbeats approaching fast. She looked up to see Kyle riding in hard, his face grim, and her heart clenched with sudden fear. "What is wrong?" she called as he swung down from his horse. "Rustlers," Kyle said shortly, his jaw tight. "I found sign up in the north pasture. Looks like they took about 20 head last night." Florence felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. She had heard about cattle rustlers, about the violence that sometimes erupted over stolen livestock. "What are you going to do?" "I am riding into town to report it to the sheriff," Kyle said, already moving toward the cabin to retrieve his rifle. "I will probably be gone most of the day, maybe into the night. I want you to stay inside, keep the door locked, and keep the rifle loaded and close." "Can you do that?" Florence nodded, pushing down her fear. "I can do that. Be careful, Kyle." He paused long enough to kiss her hard and quick. "I will, I promise." She watched him ride off toward town, then went inside and secured the cabin as he had instructed. The afternoon passed with agonizing slowness, every sound making her jump, every shadow seeming sinister. She tried to distract herself with mending, but her hands shook too much to make neat stitches. Kyle did not return until well after dark. Florence heard his horse and rushed to the door, peering out through the crack, before unbarring it to let him in. He looked exhausted and frustrated, his face drawn. "The sheriff is organizing a posse to go after them tomorrow," he said, collapsing into a chair. "But chances are the rustlers are long gone by now. 20 head, Florence. That is nearly a quarter of my herd, months of work and money just gone." Florence knelt beside his chair, taking his hand. "I am so sorry, Kyle. Is there anything I can do?" He pulled her up into his lap, burying his face in her neck. "Just this," he murmured. "Just be here. That is enough." They sat like that for a long time, holding each other in the lamplight, and Florence felt the depth of her love for this man wash over her like a wave. She would do anything for him, she realized. Anything to ease his burdens and help him succeed. The posse rode out the next morning, and Kyle went with them despite Florence's protests. She spent the day in an agony of worry, unable to focus on any task, jumping at every sound. But when Kyle returned that evening, he was unharmed if disappointed. The rustlers' trail had gone cold at the state line, and there was no way to pursue them further. "It is a loss we will have to absorb," Kyle said grimly that night at supper. "It will set us back, but we will manage. We always do." Florence reached across the table and took his hand. "We will manage together," she said firmly, and they did. The winter that followed was hard, money tight and supplies stretched thin, but they made it through. Florence learned to make a little go a long way, stretching meals and repairing clothes until they could be repaired no more. Kyle worked from dawn until well past dark, building up the herd again, repairing fences, preparing for spring. Through it all, their love deepened and strengthened. They had their arguments, of course, moments of frustration and snapped words born of exhaustion and worry. But they always found their way back to each other, always took the time to apologize and reconnect. Spring arrived with a burst of wildflowers and new calves, and with it came hope renewed. The herd was growing again, the vegetable garden was planted and thriving, and Florence had good news of her own to share. She waited until they were sitting on the porch one evening, watching the sunset, Kyle's arm around her shoulders and her head resting against his chest. "Kyle," she said softly, "I have something to tell you." He tilted her face up to look at him, his eyes concerned. "What is it? Is something wrong?" "Nothing is wrong," she assured him, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat belly. "In fact, something is very right. We are going to have a baby, Kyle. Sometime in early October, I think." For a moment, Kyle just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then his face broke into the biggest smile Florence had ever seen, and he let out a whoop of joy that probably carried all the way to town. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing, then immediately set her down again, suddenly anxious. "I should not have done that," he said, his hands hovering over her as if she might break. "Are you all right? Should you be sitting down? Do you need anything?" Florence laughed, joy bubbling up inside her. "I am fine, Kyle. Pregnant women do not shatter like glass." But Kyle fussed over her anyway and continued to fuss over her as the months passed and her belly grew round. He took over the heavier chores without being asked, brought her wildflowers from the fields, rubbed her aching feet in the evenings. He talked to the baby through her belly, telling their unborn child about the ranch and the mountains and all the things they would do together. The baby arrived on a crisp October morning in 1883, after a labor that lasted through the night and left Florence exhausted but exhilarated. Mrs. Paulson had come out to the ranch to help with the birth, and when she finally placed the squalling, red-faced infant in Florence's arms, Florence felt her heart expand in a way she had not known was possible. "A boy," Mrs. Paulson announced with satisfaction. "A fine, healthy boy." Kyle, who had been pacing downstairs in an agony of worry, came bounding up the ladder the moment he was called. He stopped short at the sight of Florence in the bed, holding their son, and Florence saw tears streaming down his face. "Come meet your son," she said softly, and Kyle approached slowly, reverently, as if approaching something holy. He sat on the edge of the bed and carefully took the baby when Florence offered him, cradling the tiny bundle with surprising competence. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "I am your father, and I promise I will do everything in my power to give you a good life." They named him Thomas, after Florence's father, and he was a healthy, hungry baby who kept them up at all hours but filled their home with joy. Kyle was a devoted father, getting up with Florence for the night feedings, changing diapers without complaint, spending hours just holding his son and marveling at the perfection of tiny fingers and toes. The years that followed were full and rich, marked by the rhythms of ranch life and the growing family. Thomas was followed 2 years later by a daughter, Margaret, who had her father's green eyes and her mother's dark hair. Then came another son, James, and finally another daughter, Catherine. The cabin expanded to accommodate the growing family, with Kyle adding on 2 bedrooms and a proper kitchen. The ranch prospered too. Kyle's reputation as an honest, hard-working rancher grew, and with it, his herd and his fortunes. They were never rich, but they were comfortable, with enough to meet their needs and a little extra for small luxuries. Florence became a respected member of the community, known for her kindness and competence, and she made friends who became as close as family. Through it all, through the challenges and the joys, the hard years and the prosperous ones, Florence and Kyle's love remained the center of everything. They still sat on the porch together in the evenings when they could, watching the sun set over the mountains they both loved. They still held hands as they fell asleep at night. They still found ways to surprise each other, to make each other laugh, to show their appreciation and affection. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1902, Kyle surprised Florence with a trip to San Francisco, their first real vacation away from the ranch since they had married. They stayed in a hotel with running water and electric lights, ate in fancy restaurants, and walked along the waterfront watching the ships come and go. It was magical and strange and wonderful, but by the end of the week, they were both eager to return home to the ranch and their family. On the train ride back, Florence leaned against Kyle's shoulder, watching the landscape roll past the window. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Marrying a silly 18-year-old girl who lied about her age." Kyle pulled her closer and kissed the top of her head. "Never," he said firmly. "Not for one single moment. You were exactly what I needed, Florence, even if I did not know it at the time. Age was just a number, but courage and love and determination, those are what really matter, and you had all of those in abundance." Florence tilted her face up to kiss him, not caring about the other passengers who might be watching. "I love you, Kyle Thornton. I have loved you since that first night in Independence when you held my hands and told me you did not care about numbers. And I love you, Florence Thornton. I will love you until the day I die and beyond." The years continued to pass, bringing grandchildren and then great-grandchildren. Thomas took over the running of the ranch as Kyle grew older, but Kyle and Florence remained in the expanded cabin, now surrounded by gardens and fruit trees and a lifetime of memories. They watched their children and grandchildren grow and thrive, spreading out across California and beyond, but always coming home to the ranch for holidays and special occasions. On a warm evening in the summer of 1925, Florence sat in her rocking chair on the porch, now much expanded and shaded by mature oak trees that had been saplings when she first arrived. She was 81 years old, her dark hair gone silver, her face lined with years of sun and smiles, but her eyes were still bright and sharp. Kyle sat beside her in his own chair, 89 years old and moving more slowly these days, but still sharp-witted and strong in spirit. They held hands as they watched the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in the glorious colors they had watched together for over 40 years. Around them, they could hear the sounds of their great-grandchildren playing in the yard, their laughter floating on the evening air. "Not bad for a mail-order bride and a cowboy," Kyle said, squeezing Florence's hand gently. Florence laughed, the sound still as bright as it had been when she was 18. "Not bad at all," she agreed. "Though I still say the best decision I ever made was confessing that lie to you that very first week. And the best decision I ever made was telling you I did not care about numbers," Kyle said. "Just look at what we built together, Florence. A family, a home, a legacy. All because we took a chance on each other." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky darkened, and the stars began to emerge, one by one, like diamonds scattered across velvet. Florence thought about the terrified 18-year-old girl who had stepped off that stagecoach 43 years ago, clutching her carpet bag and her secrets. She thought about how that girl could never have imagined the life that awaited her, the love that would sustain her through hardships and celebrations, through losses and triumphs. She thought about all the moments that had brought them to this one, sitting together in the twilight of their lives, surrounded by the evidence of their love in the form of children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, in the form of the thriving ranch and the sturdy house, in the form of a lifetime of shared memories, and inside jokes and quiet understandings. "I would not change a single thing," Florence said softly, "not one single moment of our life together." Kyle brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "Neither would I, my darling, neither would I." They continued to sit together as darkness fell. Two souls who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful and lasting. The lie that had brought Florence to Independence had been forgiven and forgotten long ago, transformed into just another thread in the tapestry of their shared history. A reminder that sometimes the most important truths have nothing to do with numbers or facts, but with courage and love and the willingness to take a chance on something unknown. Inside the house, Florence's granddaughter Sarah was preparing supper, and soon she would call them in to eat. The family would gather around the big table Kyle had built years ago, expanded now to accommodate the growing generations, and they would share food and stories and laughter. And later, when everyone had gone to their various beds and the house had quieted, Kyle and Florence would climb the stairs to their bedroom, moving slowly but together, and they would lie down in the bed they had shared for more than 4 decades. And Kyle would pull Florence close, tucking her against his chest the way he had done almost every night since their wedding, and he would whisper, "Good night, wife." And Florence would smile in the darkness and reply, "Good night, husband." And they would fall asleep together, hands clasped, hearts beating in time, two people who had become one through years of love and labor and commitment. The ranch would continue on after them, passed down through the generations, but the true legacy of Florence and Kyle Thornton was not the land or the cattle or the buildings. It was the love they had built and nurtured and protected, a love that had started with letters and lies and leaps of faith, and had grown into something unshakable and true. It was a love story for the ages, born in the Wild West, and lasting through decades of change and challenge. It was proof that sometimes the most important journeys begin with a single act of courage, and sometimes the most enduring love stories start with someone saying, "I don't care about numbers," and that was more than enough.